All right. Hello, everyone. We're live. Um, so, well, in this video, I'm gonna be going over 103 arguments against God. I just, I've been bored and have been just like writing down arguments, and they pile up over time. You just write down arguments whenever you think of something against God, and so yeah. So here's my list. So the first argument is the problem of natural evil. Premise 1 is if there were a God, there would not be unnecessary natural suffering. Premise 2, there is unnecessary natural suffering, therefore there's not a God. Now, maybe you think that there would be some natural suffering, but there surely would not be unnecessary natural suffering. All of the natural suffering that exists would serve a purpose such that the world would be worse in its absence, such that God would have a morally sufficient reason for allowing it. There's no more, God wouldn't have there be any suffering for which there's no morally sufficient reason. But it seems like there are evils in nature for which there is no morally sufficient reason. The fawn who dies in the forest fire, the Echinomendae, which is a type of wasp that spreads by planting its eggs in the brains of other animals until they hatch, killing the animals. And so that's the basic argument, the problem of natural evil. It's not specific to natural suffering. It's just it's not specific to suffering in nature. It's just generically natural evil. Second is the problem of moral luck. Premise 1, if there were a God, our virtue would not depend on factors outside our conscious control. This premise is logical. There's no reason for our virtue to be tied to external factors. If God is truly just, then he shouldn't punish us for bad luck. Premise 2, virtue does depend on factors outside of our conscious control. Things like lead and water, upbringing, and cultural traditions determine a person's virtue. And so the presence of moral luck, of factors outside of people's control having major effects on how moral people are, is quite probable on naturalism, but very surprising on theism. Therefore, there's not a God. It follows from the previous premises. Third is the argument from animal suffering. 1, if there were a God, animals would not suffer unnecessarily. 2, animals do suffer unnecessarily. Therefore, there is no God. The suffering of the deer who is eaten by a lion is not needed, nor is the suffering of wild animals from disease. And bear in mind that this suffering has been going on for quite literally millions of years before humans were ever on the scene. And so as a result of this, it can't be necessary for human virtues or human flourishing. That can't explain why Triceratops gored T-Rexes. Well, actually, they didn't technically. They were around like millions of years apart, but you get the idea. Why T-Rexes ate other dinosaurs, causing vast amounts of suffering. And it seems like the standard theodicies that people use to explain regular suffering are unable to explain animal suffering. And so I think that this account ultimately is not the theodicies that try to explain animal suffering don't work very well. Fourth is the argument from nature containing more suffering than well-being. If there were a God, we animals would experience more well-being than suffering. We think that well-being is prima facie good. If you see an animal in pain, you should try to help it. And so we would expect on theism that maybe there would be some natural suffering, but surely animals would have good lives on net. By the way, one person who's watching, can you hear me? Is the audio good and everything? Okay, so animals may have a little bit of suffering, but their lives would be good on net. However, animals' lives seem not to be good on net. This is supported by research from people like Tomasic and Horta. Most animals are strategists, which means that they have thousands or millions of offspring, very few of whom survive to reproduce. Salmon, for example, lay 10 million eggs. And so that means that the lives of the vast majority of sentient beings are nasty, brutish, and short. And so it follows from those two premises that there is not a God. If there were a God, nature would be good overall. Most animals live decent lives. They don't, so there's no God. Fifth is the argument from suffering in dreams. This one is unique to me. And so premise 1, if there were a God, we would not experience unnecessary suffering in dreams that we later forget. The suffering can't have instrumental value because we forget about it later, and it has no causal impact on the real world. Premise 2, we do experience unnecessary suffering in dreams that we later forget, therefore there is no God. The conclusion follows from the premises, so one of the premises has to be false. This is not the most sort of the problem of evil with the most force, but it does seem hard to give an account of why God allows evils that have no long-term effect on our psychology that we later forget about. That seems like something that's quite difficult to explain. Sixth is the argument from depression. Premise 1, if there were a God, there would not be depression. This is logical. We generally treat depression as a bad thing that ought to be cured, and that it's bad when people are depressed. And so God would not make depression. There's no reason to do it in the first place. But there is depression, therefore there is no God. These are all just instances of evil. Now, you may object that I'm double counting evil for some of these arguments, and perhaps I am, right? But this is in part, well, it was inspired by Fodor and Digital Gnosis's 500 plus arguments against God, but it's also making fun of the 150 plus arguments against God given by Capturing Christianity. So there may be a little bit of double counting, but it does seem hard to account for all of these distinct instances of evil. 7 is the argument from disease. If there were a God, there would not be disease that kills large numbers of innocent people, such as malaria, flesh-eating parasites, and COVID. These diseases are rightly recognized as prima facie bad, such that if we could cure malaria, most people agree that we ought to. Premise 2, there is disease that kills large numbers of innocent people, such as malaria, flesh-eating parasites, and COVID. Therefore, there's no God. 8 is the argument from base hedonic state. Premise 1, if there were a God, our base hedonic state would be very good. To clarify, this is saying that if there were a God, we would be very happy all of the time because happiness is better than sadness. Premise 2, our base hedonic state is not very good. To clarify, a perfect God could make all of our good experiences far better, such that when we're happy, we experience more happiness. All plausible moral views hold that it's prima facie good when people are happy, and so making it so that when people experience happiness, they experience 10 quadrillion times as much happiness, which is not something that's outside the bounds of an omnipotent being, would be something that we would predict an omnipotent being to do. 9 is the argument from good taste. 1, if there were a God, good tasting food would be universally healthy. Good taste is good, all else equal. When deciding whether or not to eat a food, we take ourselves as justified in being more willing to eat foods we like than foods we don't like. Surely the world would be better if spinach tasted delicious to most people and chocolate tasted bad. Premise 2, good tasting food is not universally healthy, therefore there is not a God. And this does seem true. It seems like if any of us had the ability to press a button and to make all good tasting food very healthy and all healthy food very good tasting, it would be good to do so. Well, God has that button, and God doesn't press the button. So that cries out for an explanation, as William Lane Craig is fond of saying. 10 is the argument from hunger. 1, if there were a God, there would not be hunger. Hunger is bad. It causes vast amounts of unnecessary misery and starvation. A world where we did not need to eat food, but could nonetheless eat food, if to the extent that we like the taste, would be a much better world than one in which we literally die if we don't eat food. That seems like a pretty poor design, and one that results in like millions of people starving to death. Some immense percentage of all people who have ever lived have starved to death. So that seems more strongly predicted on atheism than on theism. 11 is the argument from technological black balls. So premise 1, if there were a God, there would not be the possibility of developing technologies that could easily wipe out civilization. This is logical, right? We would expect God to make it so that our scientific innovations are good for us and are good for the world. And yet it would be very surprising on theism for God to make it so that things or scientific advances that we would think would be good for the world actually have hidden downsides, such that when we invest in science and in doing things that presumably God would approve of, that risks the end of the world. But premise 2 is that there is the possibility of developing technology that could easily wipe out civilization. Nuclear weapons fall in that category, so does bioengineering. AI also plausibly falls in that category. Therefore, there's not a God. They might object to premise 2 Well, they could object to either premise. They could object to premise one with the sort of classical skeptical theism route. And I don't think that that will work for reasons that we'll get to a little bit later. But it does seem like these instances of evil flip many of the theodicies, because they make it so that when we are virtuous and when we learn new things, that there's just the chance of developing new technology that would wipe out civilization. To the extent that they object to premise two, well, nuclear weapons seem like a very obvious category for that. And this would also require them denying pretty widely accepted theses about AI, such as the orthogonality thesis, the risk of frightening AI-related superintelligence. And so overall, I think that all of these premises are decently likely to be true. 12 is the argument from unspeakable horror. 1. If there were a God, the worst forms of suffering's undesirability would not outweigh the desirability of most good experiences by orders of magnitude. But premise 2 is that the worst forms of suffering and this undesirability does outweigh the desirability of most good experiences by orders of magnitude. When we think about how bad the most brutal torture is, or being burned alive, being fried in a metal bowl, to use an example Brian Tomasic has given, or being skinned alive, it's hard to imagine why that intense degree of suffering would be part of an allegedly perfect design. Why that immense suffering couldn't be lessened even just slightly, right? Why it couldn't just be made even slightly less. And it seems like on theism, we would expect the best experiences to possess more goodness than the worst experiences possess badness, for the greatest pleasures to outweigh the worst sufferings. And yet on atheism, it seems like we would expect the opposite, and that's what we see. So this is evidence for atheism over theism. 13 is the argument from sleep. 1. If there were a God, humans wouldn't need to sleep. If you were designing a species from scratch, why the heck would you make them spend nearly half their time lying down doing nothing? It's just such a waste of like half of our lives. But humans obviously need sleep, therefore there's not a God. These just go to show that humans don't seem to be designed very well. They don't seem like they are the designs of an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent designer. 14 is the argument from evolution. 1. If there were a God, there would not be evolution. Evolution is an inefficient process that involves creating species through random trial and error over the course of millions of years that wipes out the vast majority of beings. 99% of all organisms who have ever lived are extinct. And the Bible also suggests that organisms were created by intelligent design rather than evolution. So that's another reason to expect evolution. As to expect that on theism, we would not have evolution. It would be like designing a bridge by throwing together a bunch of random assemblage of bridges until eventually you get a bridge. That wouldn't be a very good way to design a bridge, and it's similarly not a very good way to design a species. However, there is evolution. The scientific support for that is overwhelming. Therefore, there is no God. 15 is the argument from the problem of evil. 1. If there were a God, there would not be enough evil to make the problem of evil compelling. 2. There is enough evil to make the problem of evil compelling, therefore there is no God. This premise seems plausible. Well, it's true that maybe the theist can show that God would have some reason for evil. I don't think they can, but even if they do that, it's not clear why there would be so much evil to make it so that the problem of evil is an argument that so many people find to be so compelling. If there were a perfect God, you would expect the amount of evil to not be great enough to make the problem of evil very compelling. So the fact that it is evidence against God. Yeah, me sneezing, that's also more strongly predicted on atheism. Sneezing doesn't seem to be a very good design either, especially when you're sort of about to sneeze and then sneeze but then you don't sneeze and then it like hurts your nose. That's much more strongly predicted on atheism than on theism. 16 is the problem of maximization. And this one's original to me. Premise 1, if there were a God, God's goals would be maximally achieved. This follows from what a goal is. Agents try to maximally achieve their goals. Premise 2, God has infinite ability to achieve his goals. Therefore, if there were a God, God's goals would be infinitely achieved. But God's goals are not infinitely achieved, therefore there's no God. So this is a general objection to omnipotence combined with assumptions about what the world is like, right? So if you had an omnipotent paperclip maximizer, then you would expect the world to be filled with paperclips. And so if God is optimizing for something, then you would expect the world to be filled with whatever he's optimizing for. Let's say that you think that what God wants is a relationship with us. Well, then you would think that God would be able to bat more than 300 in terms of getting humans to have a close relationship with him. That God would be able to convince lots of people to have a deep and close relationship with him if he were trying to achieve that goal. And so whatever God's goals are, we would expect them to be infinitely achieved, but they're not infinitely achieved. Therefore, there cannot be an omnipotent God that has some coherent goal. 17. The 17th argument is the problem of headaches. 1. If there were a God, there would not be headaches. They're just painful and serve no purpose. Additionally, there are cluster headaches, which are so immensely painful that they drive lots of people to the brink of suicide. But there are headaches, therefore there's no God. 18 is the problem of divine hiddenness. Okay, Oscar says, but being fried in a metal ball is merely the lack of not being fried in a metal ball. That's actually true. It is. Yeah, no, it's just a privation of not being fried in a metal ball. Very good point. Now, I previously thought that it was bad to be fried in a metal ball, but after being informed that it's merely a privation, I suppose it's not that bad at all. Vikram says, but what if God wanted people to have free will and have people choose him? Well, so in order for people to choose you, I assume that this goes to address hiddenness, but in order for people to choose you, they have to know that you exist. It would be hard to enter into a loving relationship with one's father if they were not aware of their father's existence. So 18 is the problem of divine hiddenness. If there were a God, God would reveal himself. He doesn't reveal himself, therefore there's no God. This is supported by the fact that God allegedly wants to have a relationship with us, but you can't have a relationship with someone if you don't know that they exist. If God is loving and wants a loving relationship, then that's incompatible with God remaining hidden. 19, and this is somewhat related to the problem of divine hiddenness, is the problem of inconsistent revelation. Premise 1, if there were a God, revelation would all point toward the same God. Premise 2, revelation does not all point toward the same God, therefore there is not a God. This is supported by the strange phenomena of hundreds of different people having divine revelations that lead them to different gods. If they are all backed by God, then God is screwing with us. If they're not all backed by God, then it's curious why God implants in us a psychological mechanism that detects a variety of divine revelations from gods that don't exist. That seems like a pretty crappy design. 20 is the argument for mind-body dualism. Premise 1, if there were a God, you would expect total mind-body dualism. This premise is reasonable. It's strange that we're morally punished for things that we do, which are influenced by random physical effects outside our control, such as where there's lead in the water, whether we've gotten enough sleep, or even whether we've had our morning cup of coffee, to quote Sean Carroll. Premise 2, there is not total mind-body dualism. Our mind is obviously affected by physical conditions, therefore there's not a God. 21 is the argument from obvious improvement. Premise 1, if there were a God, there would not be lots of obvious possible improvements to the world. There wouldn't be easy ways of making the world better if it were perfectly designed. Much like a perfect architect would not have numerous easy improvements in the architectural design. But premise 2, there are lots of obvious possible improvements to the world, like not making malaria flesh-eating parasites, reducing the horrors of torture, making it so that like stubbing your toe is not so painful, making it so that we could fly. Like there are just like millions of ways of making the world better, which is very surprising on theism. Vikram says, but what if God wanted people to have free will and have people close to him? Well, that doesn't respond to any of the arguments. Okay, then he says, but God did reveal himself when he brought Jesus back. But what about all my personal divine revelations? Well, Vikram's an atheist. He's just kidding around. But the historical evidence for Jesus is incredibly shoddy. It's like testimonies decades after the fact from shoddy historical sources that contradict each other rampantly. It's not very good evidence. If there were no easy ways to make the world better, what would humans do? Well, humans could make the world, so you could make it so that humans can still interact with each other in ways that in ways that improve the world, but it's a question of whether or not the world would be perfectly designed from the outset. And so if there were a God, we would expect the world to be optimally designed. But the fact that the world is not optimally designed means that there's not a God. We can still help each other out, but it's not clear why there's any grand purpose from eradicating malaria, and why an omnipotent God couldn't figure out other problems to give us that don't involve thousands of children dying every day. It's all about us using our own souls to improve ourselves, which is the meaning of life. Well, if that's true, then should we not get rid of malaria because malaria serves productive soul-building purposes? And couldn't God not test our souls in other ways that don't require thousands of children dying every day? This also makes no sense in the context of soul-destroying evils like, diseases. When 5-year-olds get brain cancer, their souls aren't destroyed in a Christian sense, but they can't build their soul anymore because they're dead. Matthew, I was pretty skeptical when I heard you had a YouTube channel. Okay. Thanks, Vikram. Okay, so 21 is the argument from 22 is the argument from moral uncertainty. Premise 1. If there were a God, there would not be a moral uncertainty. But there is moral uncertainty, therefore there is no God. This seems intuitive for a couple of reasons. For one, theists will often say that God writes a moral law on our hearts. But if the moral law is written on our hearts, why the hell does the moral law that's written on our hearts have so many errors in it? If God was writing a moral law on our hearts, you would expect the moral law to be well written and not to be contradictory. Second, making it so that we're uncertain about the true morality generates pointless conflict interpersonally that could be avoided. Third, our moral uncertainty makes it so that we often act wrongly without meaning to. The deontologist who doesn't flip the switch in the trolley problem means to act morally but acts wrongly. And yet it seems like it's hard to give an account of why God would make us act immorally even when we're trying to act morally. So 23 is the argument from bad design. If there were a God, there would not be bad designs of biological mechanisms, but there are bad designs of biological mechanisms, therefore there's no God. Examples of bad designs include inefficient thumb bones, giraffe necks, or systems for breathing and for eating being so close to each other, resulting in lots of people choking. These bad designs in nature are much more strongly predicted on atheism than on theism. 24 is the argument from, isn't moral uncertainty just something that we have ourselves because of our limited information? Can we not just say that finding the best morals and attaching consequences to those things is good? Well, you can, but it seems like on theism, if God's writing the moral law on our hearts, he would at least do us the favor of having the moral law that's written on our hearts not be error-ridden. 24 is the argument from free will. If God exists, we have free will. That is premise 1. Premise 2, if God exists, God knows everything we'll do in advance. Premise 3, if God knows everything we'll do in advance, we don't have free will. Therefore, if God exists, we do and don't have free will. If God existing requires not having free will, God doesn't exist. Therefore, God doesn't exist. Pretty straightforward argument. 25 is the argument from the Garden of Eden. Premise 1, if God exists, the Garden of Eden was perfect. But the Garden of Eden wasn't perfect, therefore God does not exist. The supporting arguments for premise 1 are, 1, that if the Garden of Eden was perfect, it would have had lots of people with good lives, but it didn't have lots of people with good lives, therefore the Garden of Eden wasn't perfect. A world with only 2 people is not perfect, given that it doesn't have more people. Generally, we think that bringing more people with good lives into existence is a good thing that should be done. And so that shows that the problem of evil was not perfect. The Garden of Eden was not perfect. 26 is the argument from the Holocaust. If God exists, the Holocaust wouldn't have happened. It did happen, therefore God does not exist. Hopefully they don't object to premise 2. And I think that premise 1 is supported by general considerations relating to evil. 27 is the argument from biblical inerrancy. Premise 1, if there were a God, the Bible would be inerrant. The Bible isn't inerrant, therefore there's not a God. The Bible has way too many contradictions to be the inerrant word of God. Micah 7:18 claims God's anger lasts forever, while Jair 17:4 claims it doesn't. Ecclesiastes 1:4 says the universe shall be eternal, yet 2 Peter 3:10 says the universe won't be eternal. I've seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Genesis 32:30. No man hath seen God at any time. John 1:18. Leviticus 24:16 of the New International Version says, anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord is to be put to death. The entire assembly must stone them. In Noah's flood, God drowns babies. That seems unethical. God could have made the deaths painless. Drowning babies is generally taken to be prima facie bad. Numbers 31:17 through 18. Now therefore, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man intimately. But all the girls who have not known man intimately, spare for yourselves. Job 2:3. The Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. He still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason. So in this case, God is admitting that he doesn't have morally sufficient reason for evil. Hosea 13:4, 9, 16. You shall acknowledge no God but me. You are destroyed, Israel. The people of Samaria must bear their guilt, because they have rebelled against their God. They will fall by the sword. Their little ones will be dashed to the ground, their pregnant women ripped open. Judges 18:1 through 28 says, and in those days the tribe of the Danites was seeking a place of their own where they might settle, because they had not yet come into an inheritance among the tribes of Israel. They said to the priest, please inquire of God to learn whether our journey will be successful. The priest answered them, go in peace. Your journey has the Lord's approval. Then they took what Micah had made and his high priests and went on to Laish against a people at peace and secure. They attacked them with the sword and burned down their city. The Danites rebuilt the city and settled there. Isaiah 13:9 through 16 says, see, the day of the Lord is coming, a cruel day with wrath and fierce anger. I will put an end to the arrogance of the haughty. Their infants will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be looted and their wives violated. Jeremiah 13:15 through 26 says, hear and give ear, do not be haughty, for the Lord has spoken. And if you say in your hearts, why have these things come upon me? It is for the greatness of your iniquity that your skirts are lifted up and you are violated, because you have forgotten me and trusted in lies. I myself will lift up your skirts over your face, and your shame will be seen. So all of those seem to be pretty good evidence against biblical inerrancy. And yet it's hard to give an account of why there would be biblical inerrancy if there was no God. 28 is the argument from biblical improvement. If there were a God, there wouldn't be possible improvements to the Bible, but there are possible improvements to the Bible, therefore there's no God. Here are several very obvious improvements. A, don't enslave people. B, don't rape people. C, treat others the way you want to be treated. And D, if it had provided a deep explanation of a comprehensive explanation of deep scientific truths. Imagine the millions of lives that could have been saved by the Bible explaining the germ theory of disease, for example. 29 is the argument from the absence of greater wisdom. 1, if there were a God, we would be more wise. 2, we're not more wise, therefore there's no God. Well, perhaps we think that God has some morally sufficient reason for allowing bad things to happen to us, for allowing us to be immoral. It's not clear whether God has a morally sufficient reason for allowing us for making it so that we're not as wise as we could be, for making it so that we're foolish. 29 is, or sorry, I did 29. Okay, 30 is the argument from causal closure of the physical. Premise 1, the physical is causally closed. Nothing non-physical affects the physical. If God exists, the physical is not causally closed, therefore God does not exist. Causal closure of the physical is generally widely accepted in physics and in science broadly, seen as a very plausible starting assumption. And so if theism has to deny that very plausible starting assumption, that counts against theism. 31 is the argument from pedophilia. Premise 1, if there were a God, people wouldn't be sexually attracted to children. Why the heck would God make it so that people want to have sex with children? That seems like a very poor design. But people are sexually attracted to children, therefore there is no God. Surely a world where lots of people did not want to have sex with children, such that there was much less sexual assault of children, would be a better world for God to design. 32 is the argument from homicidal sleepwalking. Premise 1, this one's original to me. If there were a God, there would be no homicidal sleepwalking. But there is homicidal sleepwalking, therefore there's no God. I can post a link in the live chat the homicidal sleepwalking. So homicidal sleepwalking seems to circumvent the theodicies. It involves people committing mortal evils against their free will. They don't want to kill people, but they sleepwalk into killing people. And so it seems like it's hard to give an account of why God would make it so that people murder their children in their sleep. That seems like a fairly poor design. 33 is the argument from homicidal sexual urges. Premise 1, if there were a God, there would be no homicidal sexual urges. Premise 2, there are homicidal sexual urges, therefore there is no God. This is supported in similar ways, the argument from pedophilia. 34 is the argument from pleasure and pain being linked to biology. Premise 1, if there were a God, pleasure and pain would not be linked to fitness-enhancing features. But premise 2, pleasure and pain are linked to fitness-enhancing features, therefore there's not a God. This is the argument advanced by Paul Draper. So the argument is that on naturalism, we would expect that, doing things that increase one's odds of passing on their genes would be pleasurable, given that pleasure serves as a reward mechanism. While on theism, that would be very surprising. And when we look around the world, we see that that is the case. And so that counts in favor of naturalism over theism. 35 is the argument from a hostile universe. Premise 1, if there were a God, the universe would be mostly hospitable for life. Premise 2, the universe is not mostly hospitable for life, therefore there's no God. This both undercuts the fine-tuning argument. If you think the universe is finely tuned for us, then the fact that we can't go in 99.99999% of the universe serves as very good evidence against the claim that the universe is perfectly designed. Vikram, the claim is not that only things that pass on our genes are pleasurable, though obviously there's an evolutionary explanation of why we like art. But it's hard to give an account of why there's such a near one-to-one relationship between things being conducive to passing on our genes and them being pleasurable, and vice versa. And so 36 is the argument from cosmic significance. Premise 1, if there were a God, we would have cosmic significance. Premise 2, we don't have cosmic significance, therefore there's not a God. If you look around the universe, no part of it gives any indication that the universe is made for us. And so that would, on theism, it seems like we would expect the universe to have clear signs of being made for us. And so that seems to be evidence against theism. 37 is the argument from historical ambiguity. Premise 1, if there were a God, the historical case for Jesus' resurrection would not be ambiguous enough for reasonable historians to dissent. However, premise 2, the historical case for Jesus' resurrection is ambiguous enough for reasonable historians to dissent, therefore there's not a God. This seems logical, the theists tend to say that the strong evidence for the historicity of Jesus is very good evidence for theism. And so if it's not strong enough to convince most historians, then that weakness is evidence against theism. So Vikram, so the premise 2 of the cosmic significance argument, I don't think is possibly wrong. Humans may be able to colonize large or even total parts of the universe. The point is just in terms of its initial design, you would expect us to have meaning on a cosmic scale, but we don't. 38 is the argument from racism. Premise 1, if there were a God, people would not be naturally racist. But premise 2, people are naturally racist, therefore there's not a God. Racism seems bad. It seems like if you were just designing a universe from scratch and you were making decisions about what properties you would imbue in the beings that you design, one of them that you would do is you would not have them be naturally racist. And it seems like humans are naturally racist. Here is a source. And so that serves as evidence against theism. 39 is the problem of ichneumonidae. Premise 1, if there were a God, there would not be ichneumonidae. Premise 2, there are ichneumonidae, therefore there's not a God. As an article about wild animal suffering says by Vox, which I'll link. They quote, the example of the ichneumonidae is instructive. A kind of parasitic wasp, the Ichneumonidea, spreads by female wasps planting their eggs in cocooning caterpillars. The larval wasps bide their time, nibbling at their hosts. Then, entomologists David Wall and Ian Gould have explained, when the caterpillar is almost fully grown, the Ichneumonid consumes its insides entirely and breaks free from the caterpillar skin, subsequently spinning a cocoon under or next to the host larval remains. So they just explode it from the inside out. That causes vast amounts of unnecessary suffering. It would be a priori very surprising on theism. 40 is the argument from Graham Oppie. Premise 1. If there were a God, Graham Oppie probably would believe in God. He's very smart. Premise 2. Graham Oppie doesn't believe in God, therefore there's no God. 41 is the argument from cultural contingency. Premise 1. If God existed, religious teachings would not be contingent on their culture. This seems intuitive. It seems like if God were creating a universe, the lessons that he would teach would be important ones that reverberate throughout all cultures, that pose important lessons for every culture. And yet, the way that religious texts are interpreted does seem to be contingent on culture, therefore there's no God. 42 is the modal ontological argument against God. Possibly God does not exist. If God possibly does not exist, God does not exist, therefore God does not exist. This follows in the logic system S5. It's just the inverse of the modal ontological argument for God. 43 is the argument from fathers killing their sons while they're sleepwalking. Premise 1, if there were a God, fathers would not sleepwalk into killing their sons. 2, fathers do sleepwalk into killing their sons. Therefore, there is no God. Faith in films. Why hate God? No, I don't hate God. I just don't think God exists. Do you hate the Easter Bunny? Okay. 44 is the argument from biological minds. Premise 1, all minds are produced biologically. Premise 2, if God exists, his mind is not produced biologically, therefore God does not exist. Now, Faith in Film says, you put a lot of effort in disproving something false. Well, that's true, but that's largely because I find it fun. But the distinction is, one, that there is a serious intellectual tradition arguing for and against theism in a way that there's not for the Easter Bunny. 2, I think it's fun to argue about theism in a way that it's not for the Easter Bunny. 3, there are intelligent scholars on the other side of the dispute in the case of theism rather than in the case of the Easter Bunny. But, there are lots of people who enjoy debunking, the flat earth. I don't very much, but lots of people do. Now, I'm obviously not comparing theism to the flat earth. It's obviously theism is much more plausible than the flat earth and is much more scholarly sport. But the point is just that I didn't understand why, what's objectionable about spending lots of time debunking God. Well, okay, maybe God loves me, but on your account, as was borne out in the debate, he's going to burn me forever. So if that's his method of love, then I'll turn it down. Anyways, moving on. So 44. So all minds are produced biologically. If God exists, his mind is not produced biologically. Therefore, God does not exist. Now, you might think that this is just going to be question begging, so the theist would obviously deny this, but it's very plausible that at some point we'll figure out that consciousness is just a straightforwardly mental phenomena. The same way that you can't have digestion without having a digestive system. Similarly, you can't have similarly, it could, if we accept Searle's view, you can't have consciousness without having a brain. But God doesn't have a brain. God just has disembodied consciousness. Therefore, it's impossible. And so this actually is potentially subject to empirical confirmation. If we solve the hard problem of consciousness, it might just rule out God being conscious. 45 is the argument from mortal realism. If God exists, moral realism is true, but moral realism is likely not to be true, therefore God does not exist. Now, I think that moral realism is true, right? But the point is just, if you're going to run the version of the moral argument where you're like, God and moral realism go hand in hand, well, then if someone's sympathetic to moral anti-realism, then they're just going to think that that's a very good argument against God. Why not argue that election integrity? Because I find it less interesting. And because I don't have, like, it's less philosophical. I like philosophy. I don't think that it's very loving to burn me forever. 46 is the argument from utilitarianism. If utilitarianism is true, God does not exist. Utilitarianism is true, therefore God does not exist. I think that this argument is eminently plausible. If God exists, he would just make a hedonic paradise where infinite people are infinitely happy. He doesn't, so utilitarianism and God and the world are one of those things has to not be true. And as I argue on my blog, which you can check out, here, just link in the chat. Wow, I'm like sending my sources, I think that there are very good arguments for utilitarianism. And so as Craig's fond of saying, they would have to tear down all my arguments from utilitarianism and then erect in their place many arguments for against utility for God. But until they do that, then we're justified in not believing God. So the next few arguments are sort of parodies, but you'll see. So the 47th argument is the agential cosmological argument. Premise 1, every agent that exists has an external cause. Premise 2, God is an agent. Therefore, if God exists, he has an external cause. God does not have an external cause. Therefore, God does not exist. So this argument, and then the supporting arguments for premise 1 are A, it's a metaphysical first principle. B, if agents can exist with no cause, why not Julius Caesar or Beethoven? Why is nothing so discriminatory? And C, if we see an agent, we assume they have an external cause. And so the point is just that the arguments that can be levied for this, like, mediocre, like very bad argument are the same as the arguments that are levied for premise 1 of the Kalam, right? We can't do induction based on things in the universe on the first thing. And if we do, we just get infinite atheist versions of the Kalam. So 48 is the omnipotence cosmological argument. Premise 1, everything which exists is not omnipotent. Premise 2, God is omnipotent, therefore God does not exist. Arguments for premise 1, A, it's a metaphysical first principle. B, if God could be omnipotent, why not Beethoven or root beer? And C, the inductive case that was laid out before. 49 is the physical cosmological argument. This was laid out by Scott Clifton when he was arguing with Craig. 1, everything that is caused by physical things. 2, if God exists, then things are caused by non-physical things. Therefore, God does not exist. Arguments for P1, A, inductive. B, why can't witches or spirits cause things? And C, if we saw something, we'd assume it had a physical cause. 50 is the argument from the indeterminacy of cosmology. If God exists, one theory of quantum mechanics would win out. No theory of quantum mechanics wins out. Therefore, God does not exist. It seems like if God wants us to be able to find the truth, then he wouldn't expect there to be multiple viable theories that produce identical predictions. He would allow there to be some clear sign of which view is correct, but he doesn't. So God does not exist. 51 is the argument from the paradox of deontology. If God existed, there would not be a paradox of deontology. There is a paradox of deontology, therefore God exists. God does not exist. To look for this, see Richard Yetter-Chappell's blog post, also a paper called The Cost of Constraints, or see Michael Humer's paper called The Paradox of Weak Deontology. The Bible seems to endorse a deontological type of morality, at least to some degree. And so if deontology has a paradox, then that would be an argument against theism. That wouldn't be predicted on theism. 52 is the argument from consensus. If God existed, most philosophers would be theists. Is premise 1. Premise 2, most philosophers are not theists. failed paper survey bears this out. Therefore, God does not exist. This seems plausible. Most philosophers would probably believe the correct thing, especially if God has infinite power and the ability to convince everyone. 53 is the argument from the study of philosophy of religion. Premise 1, if God existed, study of philosophy of religion wouldn't make people less religious. 2, study of philosophy of religion does make people less religious. Linked here. I did get on the Crucible and chatted with Pedro and Andrew. Therefore, God does not exist. It seems like we would expect if God existed, we would expect studying him to make people more confident that he existed. 54 is the argument from the absence of being a jack of all trades. Premise 1, if there were a God, it would be possible for diligent minds to have expertise in all domains. Premise 2, it is not possible for diligent minds to have expertise in all domains. Therefore, there's no God. Oh, also, if the 8 of you watching could like the video, that would be great, just to get up engagement and make more people see my many arguments against God. Okay, 50. So, it just seems like a perfect God would make it so that it was possible broadly for people to have expertise in all domains rather than just in a limited subset of domains. 55 is the argument from weird math stuff. This is just something that my friend sent me, and I jotted it down, and I'm just baffled by it. But, okay, I'll lay out the premises. Premise 1, if God exists, then he is omniscient. Premise 2, the first-order theory of Robinson arithmetic is true. Conclusion 1, so God believes the first-order theory of Robinson arithmetic is true. Premise 3, if God exists, either God's beliefs are consistent or God's beliefs are inconsistent. C2, so if God exists, either God believes his beliefs are consistent or God believes his beliefs are inconsistent. P4, if God's beliefs include that his beliefs are consistent, then there is a valid deduction from the set of God's beliefs to the fact that God's beliefs are consistent. P5, if God believes that the first-order theory of Robinson arithmetic is true, then there is a valid deduction from the set of God's beliefs to each sentence in the first-order theory of Robinson arithmetic. P6, Gödel's incompleteness theorem. C3, if God's beliefs include that his beliefs are consistent, then God's beliefs are inconsistent. P7, if God's beliefs are inconsistent, then at least one is wrong. C4, if God exists and God believes that his beliefs are inconsistent. C5, God does not exist. I have no idea what that argument is, but my friend sent it to me. I copied and pasted it. Here we are. Though, if you don't like that one, an argument that I just thought of, well, I've thought of this before, but I haven't jotted it down, is premise 1, agents cannot make decisions atemporally. Premise 2, if God exists, God makes decisions atemporally, therefore God does not exist. This does seem to be intuitive. It's sort of hard to imagine an agent making a choice, but that not occurring within time. How does one make a choice outside of time? Choices have to be, by their very nature, temporal. And so the arguments that are levied for why a physical thing can't be the cause of everything can also be levied similarly for why a temporal thing, or for why a being can't be the cause of anything. Okay, argument 56 is the argument from temporal fluctuation in evil. Premise 1, if there is no morally sufficient reason for evil, God does not exist. Premise 2, if there is a morally sufficient reason for evil, evil wouldn't fluctuate dramatically over time. P3, evil does fluctuate dramatically over time, therefore God does not exist. This argument is pretty straightforward. All of the theodicies have trouble accounting for why the hell the amount of evil varies throughout the ages, right? Why is there was more evil required for soul building in the 1700s than today? It's absurd. 57 is the argument. Okay, Fenton Mully says all minds react to environment and don't create matter without a body. True. Okay. 57 is the argument from suffering abolition. Premise 1, if there is no morally sufficient reason for suffering, God does not exist. Premise 2, if there is a morally sufficient reason for suffering, the world would be worse without the suffering. Premise 3, if the world would be worse without the suffering, people shouldn't try to eliminate suffering. Premise 4, people should try to eliminate suffering, therefore God does not exist. And so the basic intuition here is that if you think that God has a morally sufficient reason for all of the evils in the world, such that the world is overall better as a result of all of the evils that exist in the world, then it's hard to give an account of why God, of why you should get rid of the seemingly evils that are actually make the world better. This is usually, I think, an argument that I give against a lot of the theodicies, but it can be run out as a standalone argument. 58 is the problem of suffering. 1, if there were a God, he would maximally reduce suffering. 2, if God maximally reduced suffering, there would be no unnecessary suffering. 3, there is unnecessary suffering, therefore God does not exist. Argument 59 is the argument from, and so this is largely an inductive case. So 59 is the argument from instrumentality being incompatible with omnipotence. Well, there is a mouthful. Premise 1, if there were a God, there is no unnecessary suffering. Premise 2, if there is no unnecessary suffering, then all suffering serves a purpose that can't be achieved in other ways. Premise 3, if God exists, he is omnipotent. Premise 4, if God is omnipotent, he can achieve his purposes without suffering. Therefore, God does not exist. This is, once again, generally given as a response to theodicies, but it can be run as its own standalone argument. Argument 60 is the argument from moral paralysis. Premise 1, if God exists, there is no unnecessary suffering. Premise 2, if there is no unnecessary suffering, our normative judgments are very unreliable. After all, our normative judgments inform us with an immense amount of confidence that there is unnecessary suffering, that when babies die of malaria, that is unnecessary suffering. And so if, we have millions of incorrect first-order normative judgments, then that means that our moral judgments are very unreliable. Premise 3, if our normative judgments are unreliable, we cannot form reliable moral beliefs. Premise 4, we can form reliable moral beliefs, therefore God does not exist. And so if you take the skeptical theist route and say that we just cannot predict whether or not there is evil based on whether or not particular things would be evil, then that makes it impossible to rule out anything that God could do, and it undermines our moral judgment. This also leads to the problem of, if we think that this is true, how do we know God won't just condemn everyone to hell forever? Now, we would want to object to that by saying, well, God couldn't have a good reason for it. But if God has a good reason for all of the bad things in the world, then we can't rule out God having a good reason for this. If our moral judgments are so unreliable, then that would undermine our moral beliefs to an immense degree. And that would make it so that we can't make any predictions about what God would do. Argument 61 is the argument from cognitive biases. Premise 1, if God exists, we would not have lots of cognitive biases. Again, it seems like if you were creating beings from scratch, you would not make them have cognitive biases. But premise 2, we do have lots of cognitive biases, therefore God does not exist. Cognitive biases both undermine the reliability of our belief-forming mechanisms, leading us away from God, and also make us make grave moral errors, for which there's no morally sufficient reason. 62 is the argument from aesthetic anti-realism. Premise 1, if God exists, there is objective beauty. Premise 2, there is no objective beauty, therefore God does not exist. I don't think that there is objective beauty. I think it's hard to give an account of how objective beauty is even coherent. Are people objectively more beautiful than other people? There are very plausible evolutionary debunkings of objective beauty, and yet theists claim that there is objective beauty, therefore God does not exist. Argument 63 is the argument from unpersuasiveness of fine-tuning. Premise 1, if there were a God, most philosophers would think that God was the explanation of fine-tuning. Premise 2, most philosophers don't think that God is the explanation of fine-tuning, therefore God does not exist. Story of how I came up with this argument. I was just scrolling through the Phil paper survey, thinking, what controversial views do theists have to take for which you can make a case that theism holds X is probably not true? And one of them was questions about whether or not philosophers found fine-tuning persuasive. And so if there were a God, you would expect philosophers to find fine-tuning persuasive, but they don't, so there's no God. 64 is the argument from flesh-eating parasites. If there were a God, there would not be flesh-eating parasites. Premise 2, there are flesh-eating parasites, therefore there is not a God. Google horrific images of flesh-eating parasites if you think that God would create them, and then report back to me. I think They're very obviously make the world worse. Hey, what's up? Ask yourself. I have 103, and so we're going through them. Yeah, no, maybe it is an actual. Yeah, no, it does disprove causal finitism. There are an actually infinite number of arguments against God. Yeah, I mean, Fodor and Digital Gnosis made their 500 arguments against God. This Google Doc started with the title 1,000 arguments against God, and I've just been like adding like 20 a day or something, or like 10. Yeah, I mean, I think that yeah, it's easy to get a lot of arguments because they're just like oodles and oodles of things for which the probability of them on theism is lower than the probability of them on naturalism. Argument 65 is the argument from not being culpable by way of insanity. Premise 1, if God existed, people would not be not culpable by way of insanity. That does seem to undermine free will if people are insane, which makes them not responsible for their mortal actions. Yeah. Well, but I think that my arguments are less parasitic on each other than Capturing Christianity's. Though Fodor has 500, so he even beats out Capturing Christianity. So the not being culpable by way of insanity does seem to result in vast amounts of horrific suffering, and also it seems to undermine the free will theodicy. 66 is okay, that's funny. Is the argument from not being is the argument from the high probability of the Humean laws of nature. Premise 1, if God existed, the laws of nature would be non-Humean. Premise 2, the laws of nature are likely Humean, therefore God does not exist. I actually just don't remember what the motivation for this argument was, so you can kind of ignore it. If anyone has a justification for premise 1 they can think of, that feel free to say that. Okay, 67 is the argument from cancer in young children. Premise 1, if there were a God, children under the age of 5 would not die of cancer. You know, if you were making a universe, one of the things that you would be sure to include if you are perfectly moral is to avoid babies getting cancer. That seems like an important design feature. Premise 2, children under the age of 5 do get cancer, or do die of cancer. Therefore, there's no God. 68 is the argument from abortion. If God existed, most philosophers would think abortion is immoral. Most philosophers don't think abortion is immoral, therefore God does not exist. This is not to take a stance on abortion. It's just that you would expect that God would make it so that we were able to think things about abortion that are correct, if theists think that abortion is in fact immoral. Argument 69 is the argument from God being aborticidal. Premise 1, if there were a God and most fetuses that were conceived would come to fruition. Premise 2, most fetuses that are conceived never come to fruition. And so if life begins at conception, that means that God is the most aborticidal deity in history that brings about the deaths of about 80% of beings. Therefore, God does not exist. Argument 70 is the argument from the hard problem of consciousness. Premise 1, if there were a God, the hard problem of consciousness would be solvable easily. This would prevent accidental infliction of suffering on sentient beings, right? There's no reason for God to make it so that we don't know if there is unnecessary suffering. Premise 2, the hard problem of consciousness is not easily solvable, therefore there's no God. It seems like, if God wants us to be able to investigate consciousness, it would make it at least, Fenton Mully, the definition of God would just be the God of Christianity is mostly what I'm talking about for some of the arguments, but most of the arguments just target an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent God. And so it seems like you would not have this untractable problem for which the failure to solve it brings about vast amounts of wanton suffering. I know ask yourselves in the chat, so I can't say wanton suffering. I have to say wanton suffering. Yeah, so that's the argument from the hard problem of consciousness. That argument's original to me. 71 is the problem of fish suffering. Premise 1, if there were a God, there would not be vast amounts of unnecessary fish suffering. There is vast amounts of unnecessary fish suffering. Therefore, there is not a God. And so, this is intuitive. The theodicies that apply generally to like humans based on soul building don't apply to fish who have pretty limited memories. Vikram says, I don't think that the hard problem objection applies. It's possible that the only things that are conscious are obviously conscious, and therefore there's no massive suffering. Well, sure, but you would expect like let's say let's say pigs are. So I think that like pigs and such probably are conscious. So if pigs are conscious, then that means that there's just vast amounts of unnecessary suffering being inflicted on. Or sorry, let's take fish. That's a better example. So if fish are conscious, then we are just inflicting vast amounts of cruelty on fish. And we don't even know about it, right? Because many people think that fish are not conscious. But on the other hand, if fish are not conscious, then we're spending lots of time caring about fish that don't matter at all. It's unclear why God would make the hard problem of consciousness be so damn hard. 72 is the problem of insect suffering. Premise 1, if there were a God, there would not be vast amounts of unnecessary insect suffering. There are vast amounts of unnecessary insect suffering, therefore there's no God. This is supported in a similar way to the fish suffering one. Or at least, the premises are plausible. We don't really know if insects suffer, but it's at least plausible. 73 is the problem of souls. If there were a God, most philosophers would believe in souls. Most philosophers don't believe in souls, therefore there's no God. 74. Why are these vegans insanely inconsistent? How are we inconsistent, Faith in Films? Okay, I'll continue until Faith in Film. Okay. You're pro-murdering babies, yet HOD doesn't exist. HOD? Do you mean God? Well, wait, okay, so I don't really have a stance on abortion. So that's just not true. But also, one could consistently hold the view that because, there are just lots of ways to consistently be against fish suffering and also pro-choice. So one might hold the view that a meal is not a worthy price to pay for something as sentient as a fish or a fetus, but not having to carry a fetus for 9 months is. Okay, 74 is the argument from alternative worlds. Premise 1, if there were a God, there would not be possible worlds that seem to be obviously better. But premise 2, there are lots of possible worlds that seem obviously better. Examples include ones in fiction and just ones that we can imagine. Therefore, there's no God. 75 is the argument from tragic political dilemmas. Premise 1, if there were a God, there would not be tragic political dilemmas. But there are tragic political dilemmas, therefore God does not exist. Examples of tragic political dilemmas are cases where we have to where we have to make a choice between civil rights and reducing existential risks. So we have to make hard calls about terrorism. Similar things are argued in Bostrom's paper about the vulnerable world hypothesis, where he argues that we might need a regime of global totalitarian surveillance to prevent the world from ending. 76 is the problem of AI alignment. Premise 1, if God existed, AI alignment would be easy. God presumably doesn't want the world to end, so he would not make the world hang so precariously on a thread, that thread being the difficulty of solving the AI alignment problem. But premise 2, AI alignment is not at all easy. Therefore, God does not exist. Argument 77 is the argument from factory farms. Ask yourself, hopefully you like this one. Premise 1, if there were a God, there would not be factory farming. Premise 2, there is factory farming, therefore there's no God. There's just very easy ways of making it so that we, of avoiding factory farming, like making it so that humans just don't really like the taste of meat, or don't like the taste of factory farm meat, or have other very easy access to protein but don't like the taste of meat. Those just all seem like very obvious improvements. 78 is the argument from sadism. Premise 1, if there were a god, there would not be sadism. That seems like a pretty poor design. Premise 2, there is sadism. Therefore, there is not a god. 79 is the argument from brutal torture. Premise 1, if there were a god, brutal torture would not be possible. Premise 2, brutal torture is possible, therefore there's not a god. This argument seems intuitive. It doesn't require violating free will. After all, people who are missing arms have relatively limited ability to brutally torture people, but that does not mean that they don't have free will. The president of the United States probably has limited ability to torture people because he's being watched by Secret Service. But that does not mean that he does not have free will. And so the advantage of getting rid of the ability to engage in brutal torture would be avoiding brutal torture. And the advantage of, and it wouldn't violate free will or run afoul of any of the theodicies, and brutal torture obviously is not soul building. 80 is the problem of hiddenness from diligent seekers. Premise 1, if there were a god, he would not be hidden from diligent seekers. Premise 2, God is hidden from diligent seekers, therefore there's not a god. Pretty straightforward. Argument 81 is the argument from the inapplicability of art to the physical world. Premise 1, if there were a god, aesthetic truth would produce useful scientific results. Premise 2, aesthetic truth shouldn't produce useful scientific results. Therefore, there's not a god. This is sort of a parody of Craig's argument from the unreasonable applicability of mathematics. So Craig says that because mathematics is able to be applied to the real world, that shows that it was designed to be applied to the real world, which shows that this is something in need of explanation. Theism can explain very well. And he said that mathematics grew out of our aesthetic impulses. Well, if it grew out of our aesthetic impulses, then why didn't God make it so that other things that grew out of our aesthetic impulses also were extremely applicable to the real world? It's hard to give an account of that. 83 is the problem of dementia. Premise 1, if God existed, dementia would not exist. Premise 2, dementia does exist, therefore God does not exist. Dementia seems to undercut lots of the theodicies, given that it undermines mental development. It is extremely tragic. Faith in Film says, your intellect is a gift from God to you, and yet use it argue against steak instead of abortion. Wow. Well, I think that abortion is a much more difficult issue than whether we should engage in wanton cruelty towards animals for mere taste pleasure. You say it's just because of a steak. Well, the things that go on in factory farms are truly horrific. I think that factory farms are the worst things in the history of the world. And we would conclude that even if we thought that being in a factory farm, that animals only matter 1 or 0.1% as much as humans, we would still conclude that factory farming is the worst thing in the world. Even if we just cared about humans, we would conclude that factory farming is very bad. Given the vast amount of antibiotic resistance that it engenders, the vast amounts of pollution that it causes, the vast amounts of infectious disease that it spreads, the deleterious health effects it causes. Look, I haven't thought about the abortion issue very much. Well, I've thought about the abortion issue. I've concluded that it's difficult. You say pulling off the limbs of children. Well, so whether we're going to call it a fetus, right, is going to, or whether we're going to call it a child is going to affect our assessment of it. But also, on your view, God kills 80% of children, right? Because God brings about, 80% of fetuses that are conceived never come to fruition as a result of natural process. So, Faith in Films, why is God the most aborticidal deity in history? Why does God kill 80% of people if life begins at conception? Okay. Okay, that's not an answer. Argument 84 is the argument from nothing. Possibly nothing exists. If nothing exists, God does not exist. Therefore, God does not exist. Follows the logical system S5. This is just sort of a spin-off of the modal ontological argument. 85 is the standard logical problem of evil. If God exists, evil does not exist. It's not the case that evil does not exist. Therefore, God does not exist. 86 is the argument from simplicity. Premise 1, atheism is simpler than theism. Premise 2, prima facie, we should prefer atheism if it's simpler than theism. Therefore, prima facie, we should prefer atheism. Argument 87 is Draper's argument for meager moral fruits. Premise 1, if God existed, Christians would be way more moral than atheists. Premise 2, Christians were not way more moral than atheists, therefore God does not exist. After all, people who rely on the perfect moral tradition should surely be at least a little bit more, or should be a reasonable amount more moral than atheists. 88 is the argument from predictions. Premise 1, if God exists, theism would make extra correct predictions. Premise 2, theism not made extra correct predictions, therefore God does not exist. After all, like, why would God make it? Like, it seems like God sort of went out of his way to advance incorrect descriptions of cosmology and of science, to not point out the germ theory of disease, to condemn the practice of hand washing. It seems like we would expect God to make correct predictions rather than incorrect predictions. 89 is the argument from spread out belief. Premise 1, if God exists, belief in God would be similar throughout all geographical areas. Premise 2, belief in God is not similar throughout all geographical areas, therefore God does not exist. It's not clear why God's revelation would vary from geographical area to geographical area. 90 is the problem of teleological evil. Premise 1, if there were a God, there would not be teleological evil. Premise 2, there is teleological evil, therefore there's not a God. What is teleological evil? Well, teleological evil is evil that follows from beings fulfilling their correct nature. So this article from which I got this argument gives some examples. So it says, quote, the cruel predatory practice of the margay. Imagine being a pied tamarin monkey living in the Brazilian rainforest, and suddenly a baby's voice cries out in distress. The urge to go out and help would be overwhelming. But in reality, it's a lure set by a margay, a jungle-dwelling wildcat with remarkable mimicry skills. The North American tale true. The North American tale true, Blarina brevicuda secretes venom from salivary glands in its lower jaw to paralyze prey. But the point of paralysis is not to kill the prey, but to keep it alive for an extended period of time to allow for prolonged feeding. A tiny shrew can infect a mouse, for example, and then graze on it for days until it eventually succumbs to its physical injuries. The praying mantis is famous because the female often eats the male during intercourse, the latter being easily overpowered by his mate, but hardwired to proceed with the mating process. The sadistic part is that the mantises do not bother to kill their prey before eating them. As soon as the insect embraces the hapless lover, it begins to consume it alive. The sea lamprey. Leeches are disgusting creatures. No one's arguing that. Now imagine a 3-foot-long leech that feeds on the blood of larger prey. Congratulations, you've imagined the sea lamprey, a primitive vertebrate that resembles an enormous leech. The sea lamprey is considered a pest in the Great Lakes of North America because it often kills the fish it attaches itself to. The reason the lamprey is so nightmarish a killer is that its victims have no limbs to fight it off and must wait for their attacker to gorge itself with their blood. The lancet fluke, Dicrosoelium detriticum, is a tiny fluke that, in one stage of its life cycle, can be found in the bodies of certain species of ant. The infected ants are controlled by the parasites, and during the night they leave the anthill, climb up the grass straws, and simply wait. This leads them to getting eaten accidentally by sheep and other herbivores, inside which the parasite can continue its life cycle. Strangely enough, the ant returns to the colony during the day and proceeds with its usual activities. The parasitic wasp. Parasitic wasps are so horrifying and terrible that Charles Darwin used them as an argument against the existence of a benevolent God. To any amongst you that have seen Ridley Scott's Alien movies, the wasps use a variety of host organisms, such as spiders, caterpillars, or the larvae of other insects. The prey is stung by the wasp, which lays its eggs in it. After the eggs hatch, the wasp larvae slowly consume the victim from inside out, leading to a slow, painful death. There are links to examples. Not all natural teleological evil is predatory evil. However, a ready example can be found in the parasitic wasp just mentioned. Once inside, those eggs clone themselves until the still alive caterpillar is teeming with hundreds of larvae. Strangely, about 50 of the females emerge with large jaws and no reproductive organs. Their sole purpose for living, to devour as many of their brothers as they can, since only a few males need to fertilize their sisters. Another example is the fungus Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, aka the zombie fungus. Teleological evil seems to be a much more formidable problem for theism than mere moral evil or non-teleological natural evil. Perhaps the most obvious reason is that unlike teleological evil, moral and non-teleological natural evil involve no clear or otherwise natural presumption that such evil is intended by God. For when it comes to moral evil and other categories of natural evil, there's always the possibility, and in some cases the plausibility, that while God intended nature and autonomous agents to be good, such agents have misused their free will to cause evil, whether directly in cases of mortal evil or indirectly by repurposing nature for evil ends in cases of natural evil. By contrast with teleological evil, it is part of the very design plan and natural purpose of the function of the entity that it causes evil. In such cases, it is natural to infer that if there is a God, it is part of the very intention of God to ensure horrific suffering where this suffering isn't justified in virtue of being necessary to achieve some outweighing good. For example, on the face of it, it seems God could have created a world containing only herbivores. 91 is the argument from Mandevillian intelligence. Premise 1, if God exists, Mandevillian intelligence does not exist. Premise 2, Mandevillian intelligence does exist, therefore God does not exist. This is also explained in an article by the same author. Theism and Mandevillian intelligence. In keeping with the recent posts on non-standard arguments against theism, I'll here briefly sketch another proposed argument in that vein, the argument from Mandevillian intelligence. Roughly, Mandevillian intelligence denotes intellectual vices of individuals that, when taken collectively, result in positive epistemic outcomes. An example is intellectual stubbornness. Such a trait is clearly vicious in an individual, but when a group of intellectually stubborn individuals interact through, say, philosophical argumentation, leads to the investigation of vast swaths of epistemic space, which is clearly a good epistemic outcome. Mandevillian intelligence is prima facie surprising on theism, as individual intellectual vices seem bad, something God would want us to eliminate in ourselves. By contrast, Mandevillian intelligence is unsurprising on naturalism, as blind evolutionary forces don't care about intellectual vice, but rather about what happens to help individuals and groups survive and reproduce. And clearly, such biases can contribute to achieve such an end, as in the above case. Therefore, Mandevillian intelligence provides at least some evidence for naturalism via theism. Fenton Mully asks, is there a persuasive argument from Christianity for the existence of hallucinations that produce spiritual experience? Jordan Peterson is not compelling. No, I don't think there is. Okay, the 92nd argument is this argument is kind of a meme, but premise 1, possibly God's properties are mutually inconsistent or inconsistent with possible evils or actual hiddenness. The purpose of this is just to show that combining possibility talk and confusing things makes arguments weird. So I just combined it all into one argument. Premise 2, if God's properties are mutually inconsistent or inconsistent with possible evils or hiddenness, they're necessarily mutually exclusive or inconsistent with evil or hiddenness. Therefore, God's properties are mutually inconsistent or inconsistent with possible evil or hiddenness. If God's properties are mutually inconsistent or inconsistent with possible evil or hiddenness, God does not exist. Therefore, God does not exist. 93 is the argument from modal realism. Premise 1, possibly modal realism is true. Therefore, modal realism is true. If modal realism is true, God does not exist. Therefore, God does not exist. The support for this is that modal realism is able to provide a perfectly adequate account of all of the things that God is used to explain. So modal realism can explain fine-tuning, it can't explain morality, but it can explain things coming from nothing. It can explain why there is something rather than nothing. It can explain contingency, etc. So 94 is the argument from many worlds. Premise 1, the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is true. Premise 2, if the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is true, God does not exist. Therefore, God does not exist. So, the many worlds interpretation is sort of widely believed among physicists. There's decent evidentiary support for it, but it seems to provide a problem for God for a couple of reasons. One, on substance dualism, we have a single substance. And so if we have a single substance, then if we split, then it's not clear how our substances split. Additionally, it runs into problems with the afterlife. On many worlds, all your counterpart branches have an existence in the afterlife, And so if the soul is joined to a physical body, then that means that the branching cells will be resurrected in different bodies. So that becomes, it has difficulty with that. And then finally, it means that there are many different copies of Jesus throughout the multiverse. And so are all of them the real Jesus? Are some of them the real Jesus? Then there are many Jesuses and many crucifixions. And so this just raises a host of other problems. So 96 is the argument 95 is the argument for my existence. The probability of my existence given the multiverse is greater than the probability of my existence given God. Therefore, my existence favors the multiverse over God. It's difficult to give an account. So on the view that God only makes about that there's only one world, well, then the odds of any particular human existing are very low. But on a multiverse theory, the odds of any particular human existing are extraordinarily high. 96, the argument from religious ambiguity. Probability of religious ambiguity given atheism is higher than the probability of religious ambiguity given theism. 97 is the argument from Jesus' suffering. Premise 1, if God exists, Jesus wouldn't have had pain receptors. Premise 2, Jesus had pain receptors, therefore God does not exist. It's not clear what good was brought about by Jesus experiencing lots of suffering. It seems like even in the absence of Jesus' suffering, even in the absence of Jesus' suffering, it's not clear what good they got. And Jesus clearly didn't deserve suffering. So it's not clear what morally sufficient reason that served. 98 is the argument from moral dilemmas. If there were God, there would not be tragic moral dilemmas. There are tragic moral dilemmas, therefore God does not exist. Argument 99 is the argument from sociopathy. Premise 1, if there were a God, there would not be sociopathy. Premise 2, there is sociopathy, therefore there's not a God. Pretty straightforward. Argument 100 is the argument from the ineffectiveness of prayer. Premise 1, if there were a God, prayer would be effective. Premise 2, prayer is not effective. We have robust data for this. Therefore, there's no God. Argument 101 is the argument from omniscience being impossible. Premise 1, omniscience entails knowing infinite things. Premise 2, knowing infinite things is impossible. Therefore, omniscience is impossible. If omniscience is impossible, God does not exist. Therefore, God does not exist. And so this runs into the sort of broad problem of an infinite, which theists like to argue is impossible. 102, the 102nd argument is the omnipotence paradox. Says premise 1, omnipotence entails being able to do infinite things. P2, being able to do infinite things is impossible. Therefore, omnipotence is impossible. If omnipotence is impossible, God does not exist. Therefore, God does not exist. Argument 103 is premise 1, if God exists, an infinite past is impossible. Premise 2, if an infinite past is impossible, an infinite future is impossible. Therefore, if God exists, an infinite future is impossible. Therefore, God does not exist. Apologists will often argue that you can't have an infinite past, but it seems like that would imply knowing an infinite future. Well, Vikram, because there are infinite things that could be known. So there are infinite propositions of addition, right? There are, 1 plus 1, 1 plus 2, 1 plus 3, 1 plus 4, 1 plus 5, ... And so you would have to know infinite things. Another argument that I forgot to add to the list that I remembered as I was doing the video is Stephen Law's evil God challenge. If it is reasonable to believe God exists, it is reasonable to believe an evil God exists. It is not reasonable to believe an evil God exists. Therefore, it is not reasonable to believe that God exists. All of the ways that theists justify the horrific misery that exists in the world, serving some greater good, could also be used by an evil God to explain sorry, got distracted. If all of the bad thing, if all the good things have morally sufficient reason, then it becomes extremely difficult to provide a decent account of why of why there. Sorry. Okay, let me start. If all of the bad things in the world, getting pretty tired. If all the bad things in the world have some morally sufficient reason for them, when it really doesn't seem like they do, then all the good things in the world could have some morally insufficient reason. And so all the arguments that are used to explain how a good God is consistent with evil could also be used to explain how an evil God is consistent with good. And so if we think that we can rule out a good God, an evil God a priori, then it seems like we could also rule out a good God a priori. All right. Yeah. That's the video. Thanks for watching, everyone. Peace.